Okay, great. Thank you all for being here. You're all heroes. I have some loose notes, and then I'm going to lead into just a reading of some new work. So I guess I'll kind of time myself so I don't go over. I'll kind of move in and out of just expository speaking, extemporaneous speaking. Oof, sorry, that's not the right word. I'll move in and out of doing a little bit of reading and doing a little just off the top. So I think, and I'm glad Leah gave a little some preliminary remarks about the panel. I think the title of this panel is an interesting one because as poets, the bulk of the work we do is always going to be beyond the page. Gertrude Stein famously claimed to write for only half an hour per day, but she added, to be sure, all day and every day you are waiting around to write that half hour a day. So that's a good 23 and a half hours spent beyond the page. There's a lot for us to talk about, potentially. So I think, to a certain extent, the question we're considering here is a central one. How do we, the poets sitting here, write our poems? What do we do in the 23 and a half hours before surrounding the proverbial half hour? What do we actually do within that half hour? And this has always fascinated me, what exactly is that we personally imagine ourselves to be doing when we sit down to do the writing? What story do we tell ourselves about what we're doing as we write? And what non-writing metaphor for writing, necessarily a non-writing metaphor, but what metaphor do we use to picture our writing to ourselves as we're doing it? And so I think about these questions a lot, and when I was a younger poet, and I was sort of trying to figure out, just how to poet, and looking up, and I collected little anecdotes of how some of my heroes thought about what they were doing, sort of like the Stein anecdote, which I really liked, and sort of just enabled me in my inherent laziness, although it's great to work with her. And in general, I've always been also been interested in the metaphors poets use in their conceptions of what a poem is and how it works and how that factors into their poetics. So some examples that I've always liked and that just immediately came to mind as I was putting this together. Frank O'Hara used to describe his practice as playing the typewriter. Frank O'Hara was a good pianist, from what I understand. There's Charles Olson, obviously, in projective verse, describes the poem as an energy construct. So he says the poem itself must at all points be a high energy construct and at all points an energy discharge. And then, of course, you all remember from school all the common sculptural metaphor that's implicit in ekphrastic works like Keats' Ode on a Grecian Urn and Stevens' Anecdote of the Jar, Rilke's archaic Torso of Apollo. And then, in terms of like an entire movement, you have the related but more abstract conception of the poem as an object that you get from objectivism. Right? So there are all kinds of different ways of thinking of the poem in terms of sculpture as an object, as music, as visual art, and I'm really interested in those, and I'm interested in how common that is, maybe with poetry in particular, where the sort of it can be so difficult to get at what a poem really is that you naturally like reach to some other maybe more concrete metaphor for what it is that you're doing. I also think that we construct all these things very differently for ourselves, and so we all necessarily have very different processes in guiding metaphors. And I guess this is kind of an aside, but insofar as there is such a thing as creative writing pedagogy, maybe there isn't, but I think insofar as there is such a thing, I think a really important part of that, or a cornerstone of that, should be, facilitating the kind of experimentation that developing poets need to like find what their particular way of working is, because your particular way of working as a poet is going to be different for everybody. It's sort of like maximally individualized, and it's just a function of your particular life experiences and your psychology and your physiology and how lazy you are. Well, these are all things that you have to discover for yourself, and no one can really tell you how to do them for you. Right? And it requires trial and error. And I guess I have written here, we are each unique instruments. What did I mean by that? I think what I meant by that is, in terms of like learning to write poetry, the way poetry is written today, it might be different if like the only thing a poem was, as far as anyone was concerned, is a sonnet or something, because then maybe you could get really drill down into the details of like different metrical figures and you really nerd out about that kind of thing. but that's an available option. But really, we're all sort of creating our own poetics, as we're writing our poems in a sense. And so it's not as if we're learning to play the saxophone. It's like you're your own particular kind of instrument, and you have to like learn how to operate your instrument like from the ground up, starting from zero essentially. And I think that takes a lot of experimentation. I think it can be helpful to hear what other people's guiding metaphors are and how other people approach poetry, and you sort of try things out on yourself to eventually discover like what kind of instrument you are, and what kinds of noises you make, and what buttons you have. So for me, what has always been helpful as a guiding metaphor, something that's always made intuitive sense to me, is collage and assemblage. I remember having the thought, when it feels kind of glib, but when I first encountered like refrigerator magnet poetry, which is like supposed to be like a funny thing, I was like, that's great actually. If I had a big enough refrigerator with enough words on it, I could write an incredible poem, right? That's just always been felt very intuitive to me, just having the words already there and moving them around. I think also when I was sort of in school, I was inspired a lot by assemblage artists like Rauschenberg and Joseph Cornell, especially. There's really interesting, there's some documentary footage about Joseph Cornell and how he worked. And that was, again, something that felt very intuitive to me. And when I encountered other poetics that use those sort of methods and methodologies, I was like, okay, this is something for me to experiment with. So I'll sort of try to wrap this up a little bit in a few minutes. Yes, thank you. So how I've frequently been making poems lately, not all the time, but for the particular project I'm going to read especially, what I've been doing is I gather a bunch of text somehow. Some of it's like text that I write, some of it's text that I find, and I put it all together in a big document, and I use just an online string randomizer. Yeah, from random.org. We use random.org. I recommend random.org. And so I'll put all that into the document, and then I'll either randomize it on the sentence level. So it's just like all the sentences I wrote are kept intact, but the order is changed. Or I'll take it another step further and do the sentence level and word level. So the sentences are rearranged, but also the words within the sentences are totally randomized. And then I'll use that as a kind of source text to pull from. And especially when it's like double randomized, what it feels like I'm doing is kind of just like, you're just kind of like staring at a wall of words, and I kind of stare at it until things jump out at me. And it's a little bit like scrying, which is the sort of a divinatory practice of staring at something until it shows you things. Right? You stare at a crystal ball or into a dark pool of water or something. So that's kind of what it feels like. As I was writing this, I was reminded of another quote by William Burroughs, who invented the cut-up technique. The connection with divinatory practice is interesting, and Burroughs was interested in that, and he said something, what did he say? He said, when you cut into the present, the future leaks out. He had this idea that, in doing cut-ups or these sorts of collage-type practices, you can sort of reveal things about the future, I guess, or, but I'm interested in it for the kind of like discoveries it helps me to make. I think I want to read for enough time that I want to wrap this up. But I think a lot of this, just to go back to what I was saying before, is something that I discovered that just kind of like works for me in particular because of like particularities of my personality and like how I approach poetry. I really like to have just a sense of estrangement while I'm working. I like to have the feeling that I'm making these connections out of nowhere, even though I'm really not having them occur out of nowhere. I like the feeling of happy accidents and coincidences and things like that. Even though the ultimate result, even if I do this huge, intensely aleatory process, always ends up just sounding like something I would write anyway, right? Sort of like the Tristan Zara thing about how to write a Dadaist poem. It's about cut up an article and shake up in a bag and pull out one sentence at a time and write it down in that order, and the poem will resemble you. It always does end up resembling me. And so for me, it's just kind of a way to get myself going. I think it's kind of like a trick I play on myself, right? To get me to create work, at least for these particular projects. And yeah, and just to go back to what I was saying before, I think we all have to a certain extent, figure out what tricks we can play on ourselves that'll work on ourselves, right? And won't work. What works on me might not necessarily work on you, but it might, and it might be useful to experiment with. Okay, how am I for time? Okay, I'll just read like 2 of these so I don't go too long. So this is a new project in progress called Bird Calls. It's using sort of some of the procedures I discussed. The source text is like another project I'm writing just for the purposes of generating text. And sometimes I just like wholesale take pieces of that, but a lot of times they get mixed up. Bird Calls. It could be fun to imagine how we might change color after that, shadows licking faintly at the edge of each frame. But what is best is to watch from the intermediate zone, where the reflected blows seem to touch you, but only faintly, like the dead who through sheer forgetfulness do not stay so, but enter and re-enter, hardly at will. This is one of the pleasures of poetry, the others being the liquid property, atonement, kisses on the arms that are a prelude to moral dreams. I open my hand, close it, turn it over. Over the hot pan, the skittering of the ice cube was too frantic to be called animal. And in the morning, after the dream had faded, the way the bare legs called to each other, like hailstorms milked from the first summer-like warmth. This is the feeling I have for the water of the lake in an economy in which machines do most of the work. Each shift in position brings both relief and a new train of discomforts. The liquid property over the hot pan, the skittering into each designated chamber of the good blood, the white petals, the smoke from distant fires as I close my eyes into the dream of movement, dream in which I am asked to read, then find that I cannot. In the rain, in the dark, caked onto every surface, in one of a dozen sweet voices, not of our choosing, but of our extraction, bird calls in the apple store of the mind. 2. I have 5 of them, I'll just read 2. The parallel to this story can be drawn out further, that the picture lives, that another life is hatching there, not daring to speak, as we arrive at the party, hang up our coats, and send bubbles careening through the supplemental hills. That's what ecstasy is, in principle, in an economy in which the closer you sit, the more deeply you enter the sphere of the real. Every so often a helicopter would appear, a dream of dark presences, a single moving vine. And as the spring progressed, the fallen blossoms would congeal into a slick pink paste, the parallel to the story of how we'll all change color after that, joining the dead who lick faintly at the edge of each frame. As in the dream in which the walls of the Apple store cast their glow upon each warming event. It was a public service in that way to nudge open the gates of the visible. And if the pleasure this monster derives outweighs 100 units of normal being, and if, every so often, having walked like a baby deer through the reflected impact of the blows, a self should appear, star-shaped, geometric, an enclave within satisfaction, a missed and missing dream, well, not everyone is going to like what we do. We enter and re-enter, not daring to speak. Time, too, shows itself through this puncture in the visible. Every space bubbles over with time.
I'm going to talk about how the sartorial affects my poetics. So you all know Emily Dickinson's dresses, the white dresses. So I actually was a fashion design undergraduate, and I worked as an assistant knitwear designer in New York City for a few years. And I got fired for like falling asleep at my desk and having like little poems littered around me and like my MySpace page up. But you know, it ended up being really good. So I'm gonna start with an Emily Dickinson poem. I felt a cleaving in my mind as if my brain had split. I tried to match it scene by scene, but could not make them fit. The thought behind I strove to join unto the thought before, but sequence raveled out of sound like balls upon the floor. So it's not surprising to me that Emily would imagine the difficulty of matching the seams of a garment together as a metaphor for the chaotic tapestry of thought, how to solve the conundrum of the need for control and mastery over one's thinking with the necessity of thought's messiness and freedom if one is to obtain true ingenuity. Famously, we are told she could often be found wearing the same white dress, or perhaps a series of white dresses, like the one encased in glass outside her bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts, though she rarely left the grounds of her home. Supposedly, she filled the pockets of these dresses with poems, carrying with her scraps of deconstructed paper, envelopes, and pencils, so she could write down her impressions at a moment's notice, although pockets on a woman's dress at that time would not have been given. Still, the materiality of this garment seems inextricably tied to the making of her work. In the Baudelaire fractal, Lisa Robertson buys an antique tailcoat at a flea market because it reminds her of the forlorn poet whose work she has assumed total authorship of. Fittingly, she soon finds the garment is infested with moths and has inadvertently infected the home of her wealthy friends, a source of possible future ruin for their gorgeous woolen rugs, after wearing it to a party. I personally own a moth-eaten Missoni houndstooth sweater, which I keep trying to sell online because in my opinion the holes give it more personality, but no one will buy it. I've always enjoyed destroying pretty things. As an undergraduate in fashion design school, I would burn and tear the edges of my garments. I would accessorize them with layers of chains that I dipped in chemicals to mimic the process of rust and oxidation in order to create an illusion of something old and buried with an inventive history. I've always loved an expertly constructed garment with an unexpected raw edge. That contrast of control and chaos, risk and discipline, elegance and punk, right? Transitioning to poetry from this background in fashion design, I approached a poem as a draper would approach a design, shaping the fabric to fit the form. So sound replaced the hand feel of the fabric to create texture, and the crafting of a poem I consider as a mode of sculpture, which necessitates operations such as folding, stitching, cutting away as its methods, in order to arrive at the perfect silhouette. An entire book or suite of poems might be conceived of as a garment, and each individual poem a strand of threads to be braided or weaved into something like a tapestry. Or the book might resemble a designer's entire collection with recurring colors, textures, and prints that tell a continuous story while taking on various shapes and moods between looks. A good garment design should balance the traditions of form with innovation. While bodies can take on many shapes, there are some basic principles having to do with anatomy and movement that cannot be overridden by artistry. A garment can be designed three-dimensionally by draping directly onto the form, or another way is to work directly from a flat pattern using precise measurements to alter the silhouette. But I can't work that way at all. I need to see and feel and understand how the fabric moves, folding it to fit the curves and hollows or obscure them. To work directly from a pattern in poetry might be like starting with a fixed verse form, like a sestina, a sonnet, villanelle, and then inventing fresh ways to move within that pattern or disrupting it somehow. And draping seems to me a bit more like writing free verse, right? You can start anywhere with any shape, and the options are seemingly endless to a degree. It's a more direct route to inventing or discovering the nuance of gesture. The final calculations can be worked out later. So according to Robertson, the fashion knockoff is not so much about the garment itself, but about capturing the gesture of the contemporary moment. And for this, it retains its own special value, since that is the essence of fashion. You're agreeing to participate in the silhouette of the times, which has something to say about how you move within a certain group or groups. We like to think our stylistic choices have to do with personality, but really it's more about participation, our willingness to perform in a shared cultural affect or mood. Once the gesture is no longer made prominent or favored by the culture, however, the fact of its materiality becomes disposable and utterly useless. And here's where the original might retain its importance even when it falls out of fashion. This is where quality and craft intervene to supersede gesture. So a poem that survives its time must be well made. In order to outlive the gesture of the moment, the skill involved in the crafting of its materiality and mechanics must be evident to the discriminating reader. What are these things that make one poem, let's say, more elevated or fine than another? Just as the various parts of a garment are held together by seams, so are poems comprised of networks of stitches and seams with hems and edges. A cheap poem might make a seductive gesture, but something fails in its execution, which brings me back to the knockoff. You can fake a style or gesture, the silhouette, but it becomes harder to fake quality fabric, which is determined by the thread, natural threads being sturdier, more nuanced, and more labor intensive, as well as the sophistication of the weave. Even more telling of the quality of a garment is how the hems and edges are treated. So it takes time and skill to edge artfully, right? How a seam is finished, raw, bound, decorated, hidden, might be a way to think about how stanzas or couplets are held together in the poem, either tightly wound or achieved with a looser hand like a basting stitch. The hem is more final and in a way more consequential, and this might offer a way to think about poem endings, how we treat the finish. The turn at the end of a poem might indicate the final moment of folding right before the last stitch. And then the decision becomes how visible, how ornate should this ending be? Sliced raw, done with a control fray, open outward or folded back in on itself, see self-bound stitch. We can consider these choices from both a formal and conceptual stance. Does the form perform a back stitch, like a kind of reversal of meaning or a doubling down, like chiasmus? Did the word slip up and disrupt the pattern just when you were expecting a neatly cast hem? And so Dickinson sometimes does this, right, when she breaks her pattern of end rhyme, either subtly with slant rhyme or by utterly disrupting the sound pattern. Or does an unruly poem comprised of loud and varied gestures suddenly surprise you with a finely embellished edge, like a delicately applied piping? And so that's when another strip of fabric is added to the original seam, serving as both a kind of protection and another element of decoration. When stitching the various pieces of a garment together, you spend a lot of time running edges under the foot of the machine in long straight lines, creating seams of contact. Running lines under feet, the steady metrics of the needle piercing the fabric in and out, in and out. You press your foot to the pedal, like on a bass drum or a piano. You rock it back and forth to manage the pace. Running lines under the foot of the machine, isn't that what a poem is? As in couplets, two lines of stitching often run parallel to each other to create the seam, which then holds the various stanzas together to make the larger silhouette or gesture. Still, if you've ever worked a sewing machine, you know something always goes wrong. So it's difficult to get precise tension, different threads behave differently with different textures or weights of fabric. Sometimes the fabric bunches, a stitch gets skipped, and the thread breaks. And you might miss a turn and then have to pedal backwards, and sometimes you reinforce that mistake, or you just integrate it. And perhaps this is why I've always favored a snagged couplet. So maybe like an arrhythmic couplet where a line gets skipped or caught, like a thread often snags and gets pulled from the rest of the weave. And in this way, the snagged couplet shares an intuitive impulse for interruption, much like how native weavers across cultures will make an intentional mistake when weaving an otherwise perfect rug so as not to anger the gods. And I'll stop
Hello. Good morning. I'm deeply unprepared. I came home early last night with the intention of writing it, but I've been trying to write it for months, like 5 months. We turned at the panel proposal, and I was like, that's enough time. No, it wasn't. Anyway, so I have like a few paragraphs I'll speak around, and then I'm just gonna kind of spin, and we'll see where I end up. And then maybe read a poem that comes up adjacent to this work. I'm thinking about heaps and stuff and excess. I'm thinking about the ways in which things start to kind of outlive their usefulness or start to attract other things to the point that a space starts to outlive its usefulness. Sometimes something happens which reaches out and secures for itself a future. Like the new post boxes with teeth in the slit to keep all the world's strange men from reaching their hands in. There are increasingly fewer places to root around. Everywhere is becoming a no rooting around zone. There's something I want to write a poem about, but it's like I've forgotten how to do poems entirely. I think it's the fault of this new future coming back to meet me. But maybe I can find a solution if I can find it in stuff. Put enough of the same thing in one place, and it starts to accumulate for itself a logic. When we've gathered enough of something, it starts to make meaning. While we were doing all of our collecting, is it really so impossible to think that we might have crossed some threshold without our realizing it? all this talk of the material this and the material that. Well, okay, put all that stuff to work. I'm thinking about this because my dad's been a hoarder. He's always been a hoarder. The house that my parents live in now, the upstairs, is relatively well kept and functional, and the basement is where the garbage happens. And there's just all these rooms down in the basement that have turned a corner. Like they started out, they had a function, like the room that he was using as his shop, his workshop, moved into an old house. There were like some things to fix, and the room that was his workshop is now filled like maybe knee high with like lumber, with like nails still in, like little bits of like particulate ceiling just all over. When I go home, I bring my cat because I my best friend, and I bring her with me, and I have to make sure that I close the door because I have this terrible fear of her going into this jungle, into this room, and like all the lumber falls on her, and she just like becomes part of this heap, and I just can't stop thinking about it. So like wedge the door closed. But there's like all these things. They just like these rooms outlive their usefulness. An example I was thinking about, but like I think maybe the thing that is in this that I've always felt a degree of shame about this. Maybe not that this belongs to me so much, but is like I think this is a thing that's really true reporting. It comes out of this kind of like shame or this intensity of meaning that can't be worked around. For him, I think it comes out of the fact that he would come home from school as a child and all of that shit would just be gone. Like his parents would just like clean house, and they'd be like, this is in the way, and it would just go away. And then his mom died when he was really young, which probably some of that too. But one of the things that he did, and there's all this optimism in his stuff. Like I think he sets up these spaces and he envisions himself into the future. So I was actually really glad to hear Mike's the Burroughs quote about the future. I think it's kind of the opposite for my dad in a lot of ways. Like he orients towards future, and then when he arrives there and the thing isn't quite as he sees it, like all of that comes kind of like flooding back and like demanding objects. Like it just like needs to like make a place for itself. One of the things that he did, and I was thinking about this the other night when we were waiting for the train, and we saw a bathtub in a parking lot that was full of like weird little lettuces and like just some loose heads of cabbage, like in pretty good shape. I don't know how long they had been there. I mean, like we picked one up and it was mostly full. One of the things that he did is
you picked one up.
When you see a cabbage head in your mind, and just like encounter it, I want to root around. Get in there, but in one of the earlier remodels in the house, he took a bathtub out of a bathroom, and he buried it in the backyard, and he put goldfish in it. And for like a summer, we had a goldfish pond. I'm not sure there was even like a filtration system, so probably they were doomed from the start. But we had a goldfish pond, and he then just forgot about it, and it is now like filled with sludge up to like the level of the drain in the tub. And I have a tough relationship with my dad. He's a very sweet man, but he's also incredibly depressed. And I think we're really alike in that way, and so that has made us really distant too. And it was especially difficult after I transitioned. Like he can't figure me out at all. Like we just don't know each other. It's like really strange and really hard. So I've been trying to think my way into his stuff and his piles and his excess as like a way of, because I feel like they're so full of meaning. They become this kind of thing that is, as I said, like overfull with feeling. One of the things that happens at some point before I returned home in like the first few weeks of lockdown is he had trying, I think, to clear out a space in another room in the basement, had taken all of these chairs and put them in the room that is my bedroom. So I came back and there were 11 chairs, all sorts, like 11, like a shitload. I mean, there were like 4 of them that were these beautiful, like soda fountain chairs with wrought iron hearts on the back, and then there's this like green leather chair, and then one with this beautiful kind of carved head. It's like, I want to say it's Victorian, but probably it's like a facsimile. But there's like many generations of furniture that he just like can't part with. And I started to be like, these chairs are really meaningful, and these chairs really mean something, and I'm trying to figure out what they are. Some of that comes from the fact that the last bedroom I was in the basement, also in the basement of that house. In the years since I moved out of that bedroom into the other, he's filled that space, but he has like this strange way of kind of, it's almost like a catalog, and that space has just been filled with children's toys, like generations of children's toys, beautiful kind of like older things, and then as we get closer and closer to me, they just get like more and more plastic and like awful. But like, that's just how it goes. So I've been thinking a lot about these chairs and like what possible meaning they could divine. It's been defeating me, I think. I've like come up with a couple little projects to do it. Like I started making a couple little chairs out of found material, out of like twigs and some red thread or embroidery thread, and like one out of a matchbox from like one of the only good bars in Boulder that's gone now, like another convention center or something. Yeah, it just keeps happening. And I didn't finish either of those. And then I went home recently and I took some photos of the chairs. I was like, maybe this is the way in, and I drew some of them, and that was fun. Like I've done some kind of drawing. I was like pretty good at figure drawing for a while. And I did the chairs, and that felt good, but then that went away too. And then I tried to build a Cornell box. And I was thinking a lot at that point more about this kind of the heap itself versus the chairs. I kind of transitioned. I became really interested in the excess of materials generally, and I read an essay, part of an essay that I found really instructive in this way. It's The Disenchantment of the World by Byung-Chul Han. And in that, Han looks to this kind of figure of the heap, which he thinks may like find its form in the world as like the grubby picked over inventory of a junk shop, just like all this stuff that kind of just arrives there, and like maybe they try to sell it, but it may just be like a hoarder's desire. But Han suggests that the heap finds its home in the hollows dripped out by like our industrial workaholic urges that keep us too busy to tell stories. The heap, Han says, is the counterfigure of narrative. Events coalesce into a story only when they are stratified in a particular way. Heaps of data or information are storyless. They are not narrative, but cumulative. Counter to Han's heap is the vibrating function of Benjamin's aura, when an object singularly considered starts to consider you back. But the heap, says Han, does not. I think Han is like especially interested in inventorying data as being like the stuff of this heap. I think this starts for me to break down when we actually start thinking about the literal heap, which is like of course like full of like glittering treasures and like things that kind of step forward. But I still can't figure it out. I start doing all these projects to kind of enter into maybe writing poems about this, and it just doesn't happen. And the box is I bought all this stuff for it, and it just kind of fell apart. It's like full now of I went to the hardware store that I love in town, and I bought 100 dime bags. I was like, I'm gonna put things in them and like hang them up, but I just have like 100 dime bags in this box at home. I painted it white a few times, so it's like almost like it's like a beautiful after effect of a gallery show or something. It's like nothing. Anyway, so I actually think like in the end, ultimately that thing that happened for me is really instructive of what's happening with my dad too, of this like this intention to like make something happen and then not really being able to arrive there. Which has made me feel really tender towards him in a way, and I'm glad for that. And that's it. That's what I'm saying about that.
Chairs in your home.
I have chairs in my chairs often appear in
poems.
Stools, lots of stools. We can hope. I've been doing a lot of fiber these days, which is nice. But I am going to read. I'm going to read poems that kind of came up alongside of this work. I don't know how much time do I have. I'll read one. I think a few minutes. Okay.
You're at 10, but you can.
I'm at 10. God, I just am such a gabber. All right, I'll read the short one.
It's really lovely. So just
okay.
you need to hear it.
I've been teaching at 9, and I don't prepare as roll, and I'm like, hello. So I was prepared for this. I'll read a short one. Something novel. What doesn't exist, I can't know. A fence is built out of wood unless it is erected in steel. And either way, its pieces come in on the back of a truck. A fence works by bringing two separate somewheres together into bounds. A truck too, though there's more play in the wheel, and so there's more play for the truck's driver, coaxed to dance in a potholes not to lose jostle. It's not immaterial, this boundary and infrastructure, grasping always. As soon as I find something missing, it arrives, and still this arriving isn't nearly immediate enough. Stuff proliferates, and that's the point. Are things like gravity pressing us close? Everyone I know has too much. Books, maybe, and sheepish expression. And me too. I know myself in cozy pile, heavy quilt, and thick new sock.
So good. I'll start with a poem and then we'll talk about it. How long is the letter I? How long is the letter I? How long is the sound you?
How deep is the sound? How deep is the sea? Have you seen the letter I? Did it show up? Did it show down? How long is the downtime of a downing letter I? Of a drowning letter, of a drawn letter, of a gesture of letter to the left, of a left letter to stay unattended, unended, in a long sounding, ungestured letter, in a let be letter, in a lettered liter, in a letter trying to tell, let in pursuing the latter, in catching the latter at its end, having consulted with a tailor. So I wrote this poem while editing a voice recording of another piece. So the first line, how long is the letter I, literally refers to how the eyes I was hearing in my headphones were sounding. Editing audio has the effect of going in circles, going over the same point so you can move on. When working with an existing text, the landmarks are clear. And sometimes if I have multiple versions of the same fragment, I slightly overlap them, challenging the linearity so you wouldn't hear just one word at once anymore. For a longer time, I've had a practice of automatic writing on thin paper. The intention was to sit down to write as opposed to sitting down because the writing is already on my habitual mode. So otherwise I would just write when I need to write, when there is an urgency. It didn't have to turn into poetry, but sometimes it did. I enjoyed using color as it added complexity on a physical level. Later on, I began working with existing poems that are already typed, so like the one that I was carrying around. So the colors could emphasize connections, making them easy to spot, and forming a concrete figure, so that you would look at the list and like kind of catch something at once. Sometimes an accident would happen, and I would take it on board instead of redoing the whole piece. And even when making another version, I would repeat that mistake, so the form kind of shaped during the process and then would be reproduced in some way. So as I was working with this tool, audio editing and creating visual work, I naturally got to know some poems well enough to recite them. And the next step was returning to my first background, dance, as a mode of presence alongside the poems. So with these dance poems, I enjoy relying on a text I'm not afraid to lose once I take my eyes off it and use the available resources for communication with space and with listeners. And sometimes it takes, like, it's a bit more performative if the space allows, and sometimes like really casual in a bookstore, something like that. Should I stop?
We only have 5 minutes to do it later.
So, but I think it's better we have a discussion, so my plan was to perform one more poem, but you already got the idea.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we can always come back and give a question written, and then we can return to yours. I'll try to cut a little bit too from what I was going to say. Okay. I've been practicing deep listening for 3 years, and I'm working toward my teacher certification through Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. Though it was really only about a year ago that I was in the midst of projects that actually began to be shaped or generated by that practice. Just to give a brief definition, deep listening is an ethics, pedagogy, research method, and creative practice developed by musician and composer Paulina Oliveros, along with her partner Ione, a psychoanalyst, and colleague Eloise Gold, Tai Chi master. It's designed to expand our perception of what is audible, knowable, and sentient in our environments, primarily through 3 modes, which are sound improvisation, somatic movement, and dream work. So it's especially useful for people who want to expand their creative practice. It's also always had healing components and social political interventions and implications. And as it's both an individual and community practice, deep listening is a kind of sonic and physical articulation of Jean-Luc Nancy's claim that being is nothing other than being with one another. But instead of talking kind of above and around it, I wrote something narrative about the deep listening I was doing in 2024. Some of the gestures I made or dreamed about inside that time, and some excerpts of poems that emerged from it, so I'll just share that. In the spring and summer of 2024, I was meant to be writing a novel. I told everyone at last year's festival, I am writing a novel. But in the margins of the novel, I was running into every limit. I was not sleeping. I was making quick turns inside of my life and what might have been and what was yet oncoming. And in response, the novel's narrative trajectory kept turning back on itself. As I circled the same apartment in the same damn city I kept trying to vacate. And I found myself with no sensible trajectory whatsoever, but only this set of furious beginnings. Every instance of reaching for the word felt counterintuitive or just wrong. I felt sick of language. I felt that being in language was making me sick. While I was meant to be writing the novel at a steady tempo, my heart had fallen out of step with my body. It thudded around too slowly during the day and raced at night, and very occasionally it felt like it stalled out altogether. I wanted to get closer, or felt I already was closer, to that rupture insane Blanchot describes as essential preparation for the poetic act, but also may signal forms of arrest or interruption more fatiguing and not at all generative, or simply the hyperbolic limit of articulation, where the word slides into non-word and wordlessness indicates itself. It wasn't the ideal state, but it was a state that primed me to listen, as I was always already in the posture of the listener, tense, attentive, tilted through the ear toward the unknown, wobbling at the edge of my own eye. In the spring of 2024, in the posture of a listener, I slid in and out of the MRI machine. Against ideal states and with the spirit of improvisation I had been learning through deep listening, I started to say to myself, I slide in and out of the noise machine. In the community practice of deep listening, we often use collaborative sonic exercises to learn to listen more expansively and to improvise with sound and rhythm. For example, the listening group may begin to make combinations of voiced and non-voiced sounds, so using vibrating the vocal cords or not. And individual listeners are encouraged to listen for other sounds, then repeat them back into the room. In this way, one's ear becomes more discerning and responsive, as well as socially inscribed. The listener learns how to be part of a sound or rhythm cycle, and so also to express complex polyrhythms without resolution. In solitude or surrounded only by machines or the natural world, it is also possible to practice this listening exercise. Oliveros insists, sound is the fiber of my being and of all sentient beings without exception. I slid into the noise machine. On the outside, to the technician, I was a long magnetic scan, full of anomalies perhaps, but otherwise unremarkable. But inside the machine, a collaboration was taking place. I'll just add a little A central goal of deep listening practice is to listen 24/7. And the longer I'm listening, the more my whole body becomes more and more ear. In summer, I felt my material architecture, however arrhythmic and unrelenting, become increasingly conjectural, obscured pockets of astonishment opening between the ruin of the structure and the dream of a future. It became increasingly possible through the listening act and the ritual gestures, and even in dreaming, to find new ways of listening, new methods of moving, and so more possible relational encounters. It was summer, and I had an extended period of relief from the noise machine. I'd also been given the keys to a borrowed apartment in June for several weeks where I was meant to be writing a novel and another poetry book. It was part of my proposal. I said, I am writing a novel, and I am writing a book called Sick Future. I dreamed vividly at night and was often interrupted by my racing heart, regular rainstorms, and the playing of the ironworks factory down the street. In the mornings and evenings, I'd walk up the long winding path to the top of a hill that opened into a field of hay and thistles set against the mountains. I went listening for correspondences with my astonishment. Those strange openings, the rupture, and my ear pressed to the rupture had made in me, and that the noise, machine, and the landscape also made. I went to the field and waved my arms around, great wheeling circles. The gesture was one I'd seen in my dreams that seemed to come from lifetimes of dreaming. It was also physically necessary as the gnat swarms were unrelenting. I attended the field, and in my returns, I began to sense a kind of reciprocity, points of resonance, sound, bare vibration in the body, and the field became inexact correspondence. I was, in my current state, especially resonant with its points of rupture, dispersal, and zones of contamination. The smell of ammonia in the air, the low drone of the crop duster over the field, the sudden onset of a leaping shape in the middle. Just read this. Self-shining and feverish, an onset of suddenness slopes underneath this repercussive heaven of girls, tight-lipped and unfastening, bodies becoming more still and more listening, analogous to a state of grace. Acacia foaming, a holding station in the air, beeping and flashing, a circle growing smaller by the hour. This is not how I am. Henceforth vertiginous, henceforth in secret, chain link catching the sickness of the bird, the neighborhood, her sacred geometry of circling cassettes of also in the girl, in the orange neoprene wish, landscapes, gutter talk. The illumination zone is yet below this. It's all over my pneuma, a derelict ship gasping in the mesosphere, in the wrong season, the lips, a city running over the balconies here and there, no place not rained through. Nonetheless, I think I am beginning. I was struck in reverse, synapse by synapse, crept along with the subtle movement of the grass, the rattle of the leaves, how we stole through the little grove of trees, and please know I am sending you constantly. Escape velocities and the globalized blur of zipping June, insects and the rising desire of biting departures, the drip becomes the heavy, melismatic silence wrapping the last party this side of the rock. What is this water? I feel funny. I'll stop there.